In a previous discussion, we looked at the things Pericles said accounted for the greatness of classical Athens. Classical Athens, for all of its problems, still looks really impressive when we look back on it. And we looked at some of the things Pericles said accounted for that. And he said that future ages will wonder at us as the present age wonders at us now. And that's true. Here we are talking about classical Athens. Now what's interesting is if we fast forward a few generations, then we have a philosopher in Athens named Epicurus, who indicates that something has happened, that a lot of people have lost confidence in what's going on in Athens, because Epicurus says that we have to release ourselves from the prison of affairs and politics. So Pericles describes Athens as a participation society. A few generations later, Epicurus is saying, don't participate, right? Don't get involved in the dirty work of politics, in the dirty work of managing the state. So something had happened. It seems that there had been some kind of degeneration. We remember from a previous discussion that Plato says that communities reflect the actions of the people who live in them, right? And that kind of makes sense. People have thoughts, they do things. What they do has an effect on the world around them, and then we can see that. And so communities reflect the people who live in them. Now, some people, as Paul says, have a strong desire to focus on things in their thinking, in their lives, focus on things that are true, that are right, that are pure, that are lovely, that are admirable, that are praiseworthy, that are excellent. All right? And these kinds of people, if you get enough of them in a community, they can build a community, something like what Aristotle says here, where he says the best constitution, that is the best setup in a state, is one in which any person can prosper and live blessedly. Now, Aristotle knows, we're not going to get perfection in this world. We're not going to get perfection in human societies, but we can build pretty good societies, right? People have the capacity to do that. And here are a couple examples. We look at these photos and we see that the streets are clean. We see that things seem pretty orderly. Things are pretty peaceful. Not perfect societies. There are problems. There's a police force for a reason, but pretty good societies, pretty good peaceful societies. Then there's the other side. We remember that Plato says that in every single person there are desires which are terrible, wild, and lawless. So even among these folks and these scenes, things look pretty peaceful, look pretty calm, look pretty secure. But in those folks, nevertheless, Plato says, still lurking are these terrible, wild, and lawless impulses. What happens if those impulses get the upper hand? What happens if those impulses come to rule? Well, St. Paul had similar thoughts. Just as he describes people who want to think about things that are noble and true and praiseworthy and excellent, then you've got people on the other side who are ungrateful, they're without love, they're slanderous, right? They're brutal, right? They're treacherous, they're rash. And if you've got a critical mass of people whose thinking is like this and whose actions are springing from that, and their thinking is and their actions are characterized by the terrible, the wild, and the lawless, then what might that look like? And it might look like this. And it's really hard to believe, if we go back and look at these photos, it's hard to believe, just incredible, that the same creature can create such radically different realities in the world. Here we have relative peace, order, security. Here we have absolute destruction and chaos. And so we have to think about, how can this happen, right? How can you have a society such as Pericles describes, which is so impressive, and then a few generations later you've got a philosopher saying, I kind of give up on Athens. Don't get involved, right? Or I give up on the public life of Athens. I give up on the political scene of Athens, right? Or how is it possible that what's illustrated in the picture at the top there could eventually become what's illustrated in the bottom? All right, because remember, Plato's idea is that even among those people in these peaceful scenes, even within them are these terrible impulses, which not controlled could lead from the picture at the top to the picture at the bottom. And the picture in the middle depicts a place that's kind of in between. And that happens to be the apartment complex I lived in when I was a little kid. And when I was a little kid, it wasn't a great neighborhood, right? Far, far, far from a wealthy neighborhood. I think we could describe it as lower middle class or even a poor neighborhood. But it was peaceful, it was secure. We didn't have a gate around the apartment complex, but now there's a gate. And that whole area has become much more dangerous, much less secure. And so, over the past couple decades, that area has taken steps away from the top picture and taken steps toward the bottom picture. Obviously a long way from the reality of the bottom picture, but it's taken a few steps in that direction. These impulses, right? Impulses for the good, impulses toward things that are noble, good, true, lovely, excellent, praiseworthy. Also those terrible, destructive impulses. And it depends on which set of impulses rules, right? And whichever set of impulses rules, then that leads to things that we can see in the world. These kinds of thoughts are what lead to political philosophy, that is, thinking about how to organize society, right? How to organize society. That's what political philosophy is about, right? And one of the great books of political philosophy is Plato's Republic, and it comes to us from classical Athens, right? And it's a long and pretty complicated book. And there's a lot in the book, certainly some stuff in the book that most people these days are not going to be very impressed with and certainly not attracted to. One of the things that Plato does is he divides his ideal society into different segments, and you can see it here that most people in society are doing the normal work of society. They are the plumbers, they are the custodians, they're the taxi drivers, they're the shopkeepers, they're the folks who work in restaurants, etc. Right? So that's what most people in society are doing, and they don't have involvement in political affairs, and they're not thinking big thoughts, and they may get some basic education, but they're not getting significant education. And then above them, you have the guardians and the auxiliaries, and these are the folks who are trained to kind of manage the society, the police force, the army, the civil servants, things like that. And then from the guardians come the most fit, right? The best of the guardians can become the philosopher kings. And presiding over this society then are the philosopher kings, and we'll say a little bit more about this. But just to give you an example of some of the things that come up in Plato's Republic that a lot of people are not going to be interested in, we have this quote here where Plato says, "There's no aspect of their work as guardians which they shall be good at as watching over the minds of the children in the community," that is, among the guardians. Now, one of the things Plato says is that among the guardians, parents don't have specific control, to use that word, over their own kids. Their kids are sort of raised by the community. The kids aren't raised by their own parents, they're raised by the community of guardians. But the parents know who their own kids are. And so Plato says, if one of their own children is born with a nature tinged with copper or iron, they shall at all costs avoid feeling sorry for it. They shall assign it the status appropriate to its nature and banish it to the workers or the farmers. In other words, you've got these guardians, and it's a little complicated and we don't need to get into it, but the people at the top of the triangle, they have gold, mixed into their being. And then a bit further down, then you have the folks who have silver mixed into their being. And then in the bottom section, that's where the iron and the copper, right, is mixed into the being. And what he's saying is if guardian parents, have kids, and then they realize, of course they know, which kids in the community are theirs, they realize that their own kids aren't the stuff of silver and they're not the stuff of gold, they're the stuff of copper or iron, then that's tough, Plato says. And if you're the stuff of copper and iron, you can't be among the guardians, and so those kids have to be banished, right? And they have to go live with the workers, okay? So anyway, this sounds kind of crazy and it sounds kind of awful, And there's this kind of stuff that comes up in Plato's Republic that a lot of folks don't find very attractive, right? But an idea that we'll look at for a couple minutes here is Plato's idea that governing the community should be a philosopher, right? And the philosopher should be a person who is chosen by others for his excellence, right? And Plato's idea is that if you want power, then you should not have power, right? Because people who want power usually don't want it for the right reasons. And so we have people from the guardians who are being, or we have the guardians who are being trained, and then from the guardians emerge sort of the cream of the crop, right? The best of the best, right? And then from them are selected the philosopher kings. Here's what Plato says: there will be no end to the troubles of states or of humanity itself till philosophers, that is, lovers of wisdom. That's what a philosopher is in classical Greece. So there will be no end to the troubles of states or of humanity itself till philosophers become kings in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers, that is, really become lovers of wisdom. And political power and philosophy thus come into the same hand. So the rule by philosophers. Now that sounds nice, right? I mean, that sounds nice. Wow. I mean, what if we could somehow ensure that the people governing our community, governing our state, governing our nation, what if we could be sure that they were truly lovers of wisdom, right? I mean, like, thoroughly lovers of wisdom. I mean, that would be pretty cool. I don't know how it's possible, and I think Plato himself realized that this kind of society he's thinking of isn't really possible, but there is a certain ideal here maybe to aim for. So let's just look at this together. True philosophers, according to Plato, should rule because it's in their nature to love truth and learning so much that they are free from the greed and passion that tempts others to abuse power. Some people want power because that brings attention to themselves. Some people want power because they want power, the thrill of being able to tell people what to do, right? They want power because it brings them status. The philosopher kings, of course, they're not interested in any of that. They just love wisdom. And they're not chasing power. They're selected. And Plato even describes them as being reluctant. They don't want to rule, but they've been selected to rule because they're such great lovers of wisdom. Intellectually, these philosopher kings, they can gain full knowledge of reality, which involves the ability to think deeply about and appreciate virtue, that is, excellence and moral goodness, beauty and the good. So these are the deep thinkers, right? These are the deepest thinkers. These are the folks who really know what's going on in reality. The philosopher king rules for the good of the state. The philosopher king has no selfish motives whatsoever, right? And the philosopher king is chosen after long years of training. There's physical training, exercise, there's academic training, there's philosophical training, training in the arts of war, training in geometry, training in astronomy, training in the Socratic method. Remember, we had a discussion about Socrates going around and challenging people and asking them questions. And if you read the works of Plato, you've got the Socratic method there where, question, answer, question, response to the answer, right? The idea of trying to get at the truth of things through asking questions. And so in Plato's scheme then, the best of all trainees rises to the top and becomes the philosopher king. And I was thinking, this is kind of like the philosopher counterpart to SEAL Team 6, sort of. We've got, many thousands of people in the U.S. military, but you have these elite special operations units that are very hard to get into. They're very hard to stay in, right? Very few people make it all the way through the training. And so once you make it all the way through, and now you're a member in good standing of SEAL Team 6, for example, this is the Navy Special Forces team, well, then you know that you have arrived among the elite, right? That's kind of what the philosopher king is. The philosopher king has made it through all of this training and has risen to the top. Or maybe it's sort of like being an elite marathon runner. And there I have a picture of Bridget Koske, who at the time of this recording holds the world record for women in terms of the marathon, right? So she's among a small elite. And this is the idea, that the Philosopher King is among a very, very small elite of people who truly love wisdom, who truly see reality at its best, and who act with the best of all motives, right? And so the Philosopher King sees things the way they should be. If the mandates of the Logos, right? If the requirements of the Logos, the true, the beautiful, and the good were perfectly understood, right? The Philosopher King is the one who gets it. This is how the universe is. This is how human life should be. This is how society should be organized. And there's no questioning. This guy, this Philosopher King, he nails it, right? Now, related to this is a story that Plato tells about a cave, and people are living in a cave, and what they see in the cave are shadows, but since they've lived their whole life in the cave, then they think the shadows are real. But the guardians, and then eventually the Philosopher Kings, they're the ones who know that what's in the cave, those things aren't real, those are just shadows, right? They're the ones who see reality. And so I've got a picture here of folks in a cave, and you don't really see shadows, but you can barely see some outlines of people and lights there, right? And so that's the reality for most people. Plato says most people are kind of living in a cave, right? And it's dark and shadowy, but that's all they know, so they think that's reality. But the guardians and the Philosopher King, they're the ones who get out of the cave, and they see reality, right? And their job is to go back into the cave and to help enlighten the people in the cave, right? So this is what Philosopher Kings should do. Or this is what those who are in training to become Philosopher Kings or the elite of the guardians, this is what they're trying to do, to bring enlightenment to human society. And so Plato says this, he says, a person perseveres in using rational argument. There's that Socratic thing, right? I ask a question, you respond. I ask another question, you respond. I challenge, you respond. You challenge in return, right? So rational argument. So we use rational argument to approach the true reality of things until he has grasped with his intellect the reality of goodness itself, right? So a Philosopher King really, really gets it. The rest of us, don't get it. And some of us aren't even interested in getting it. But the Philosopher King gets it. And he manages the society for us on our behalf. Now, St. Paul has an idea similar to Plato's. Plato describes most people living in a cave, kind of in a world of shadows. St. Paul describes it this way. He says that in this world we live through a glass darkly, or we see through a glass darkly, right? And so, maybe the image we can have is, we've got glass that's dark, and we put it up and kind of look at the world through that. And, we see the world, but we don't see the world really as it is. And so this idea is similar to Plato's idea, right? Now, a difference, though, is that Paul doesn't seem to think it's possible for anyone in this world to completely break free and see the great reality, right? That so long as we're in this world, we're going to see through a glass darkly. We're going to live in the world of shadows. And it may be that, someone maybe has more insight than someone else. But it seems that St. Paul, has a different idea. St. Paul doesn't think, as Plato does, that there are some people, a very small number, but there are some people who can break free, and can see reality as it really is, But Paul does say, but then we'll be able to see, right? So now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know even as I am known. And when he's referring to then, he's saying in the next world. Not this world, in the next world. So there's a similarity in that Paul and Plato both see that, human beings do tend to live in what we could call the shadowlands, right? A difference is that Plato thinks that a small number of people perhaps can break free and see reality for what it is completely. Paul seems not to think that. Although certainly we want to have as much clarity as we can. We want our vision to be as clear as it can be, but we may not be able to break out freely, right? We're going to have to, and we may not be able to break out completely. We're going to have to wait for the next world for that. So Plato refers to the reality of goodness itself. He thinks that this is possible, right, to break out of the cave. Not for many people, but a small number can break out. Paul seems to have maybe a more realistic view that, we're kind of stuck in this world of shadows and we want to see as clearly as we can, but we're never going to have a really clear vision of things until we get to the next world. How do we get from the darkness of the cave into a place of greater light, if not into a place of complete light where we see everything, we see reality in Plato's term, but we do see with greater clarity? How can we make that move? And so, to move things on then, I want to now bring up again Plato's student Aristotle. So here's a famous painting, and we have Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. Now, one of the things to notice is that Plato's finger's pointing up, right, kind of to the realm of perfection, that realm of, of ultimate goodness, of ultimate truth, right? And that's what the Philosopher King is tapped into. And then you'll notice Aristotle's hand is kind of pointing, or it's gesturing down toward the world. I read this quote to you from Plato. A person perseveres in using rational argument to approach the true reality of things until he has grasped with his intellect the reality of goodness itself, right? And I kind of understand what Plato means, but on the other hand, I really don't. Like, what are you talking about, Plato? Like, try to describe this to me. Now, I guess Plato might say, well, the reason I can't understand it is because, I'm not sufficiently enlightened. But one of the things that I feel when I'm reading Plato is that a lot of times, I kind of have a sense of what he's talking about, but I don't really get it. It seems to kind of leave planet Earth. It seems to kind of leave the world of observation. It seems to kind of leave the world of reality. And so when Aristotle, when he's gesturing toward the earth, that's pointing to Aristotle's tendency to say, hey, let's focus on the world that we can actually see. Let's focus on the world we actually have in front of us. How should we live in this world? Now there's debate about the extent to which Plato and Aristotle disagree. And clearly they have disagreements. Aristotle says in his own book he has disagreements with Plato. He criticizes his teacher Plato, right? And he's not disrespectful. And Plato did his job. He helped Aristotle to learn how to think, and Aristotle thought and then came to the conclusion that his teacher was wrong about some things. But Aristotle and Plato, agree on a lot. But there does seem to be a different tendency, and Plato's tendency is to kind of have these big thoughts that seem to, the way I'll put it is, they seem to float around in space. But then there's Aristotle, who's very practical. And so that's, as we continue these conversations, thinking about the relationship between human nature and society. How do we make good societies? How do we make good lives? And then if you get people, a critical mass of people who are making good lives, then they can together create a good society. How can we do that? In this discussion with Plato and Aristotle, I have always found Aristotle more helpful, more useful, more practical. It's not to say Plato's not important. Plato is important, but I do think Aristotle has more to say about the world we actually live in. All right? And so we're going to turn to Aristotle and we're going to look at some things that Aristotle has to say.